also going to hit record. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. We are so excited to get things started here. I'm going to give it just a minute to have people get fully into the webinar space and on our live stream. And while we get set up here shortly. So we are so excited to have you all here today. This has been an event in the making for about a month, and we're just really excited to have you here. So thank you for joining us for this virtual town hall on anti-trans policies and social work education. We're thrilled to have so many people express an interest in this town hall and joining us on Zoom or through our live stream. My name is Dr. Meg Paisley. My pronouns are they or she, and I'm an associate professor at the University of Kansas School of Social Welfare and one of the founders and co-leaders of the Center for LGBTQ+ Research and Advocacy. I have the pleasure of getting us started today and introducing the town hall. First, I'm going to start with some housekeeping business. For accessibility, we have both captions and two amazing ASL interpreters. You can turn on captions at the bottom of your screen, and the interpreters will spotlight themselves on the videos so you can see them throughout the town hall. The chat and Q&A features are enabled. You can use them throughout. However, questions will be answered in the last 30 minutes of the session. If you're following along on the live stream, there will not be a way to answer questions live. The town hall will start with a brief introduction from our moderator, Candace Christensen. They will then ask our invited speakers to introduce themselves. Following those brief introductions, we will have about an hour of moderated discussion. The last 30 minutes will include a Q&A and discussion focused on action and social work education. What we're not doing today is an introduction to trans people and communities, and will not be reviewing the specific policies that are targeting trans young people unless they come up naturally in conversation. All of that information is accessible outside of this space. Therefore, we chose to focus our energy and our time on discussing social work education as it relates to these anti-trans policies. So before I get to the introduction, I want to thank my amazing colleagues across the United States who helped organize this town hall and all of the schools and organizations who helped co-sponsor it. For the sake of time, I won't name them all, but you can see them on this slide and on the town hall website, which we can put in the chat. 4 of the organizers are on video today: myself, Dr. Candace Christensen, who will be moderating the discussion, Dr. Alex Wagaman, who will be facilitating the Q&A discussion, and Dr. LB Klein, who is handling tech support. If you have a technology issue, please message Dr. Klein so they can help. We also have 6 incredible invited speakers who you can see on the next 2 slides. They will introduce themselves soon, and you'll get to know them and their work a bit more throughout today's town hall. So that's all the housekeeping that I have. Let's get to introducing the town hall. Just over 4 weeks ago, about 15 predominantly queer and trans social work faculty and students met in a Zoom room to discuss the rise of anti-trans policies and rhetoric happening again this year. This meeting was scheduled only days prior, out of frustration and sorrow, but also a need for community and support. These policies that target trans people are a form of trauma. As social workers, we know how our community and those close to us respond to trauma impacts our experiences with it. We were hearing about or directly experiencing trauma that was ignored, silenced, not discussed, and that went unacknowledged. This is why we chose to focus this town hall on social work education. As a field, we have the professional and ethical obligation to advocate against these policies and to support and affirm transgender, non-binary, and gender diverse students, staff, faculty, clients, and communities. As social work educators, we have to do better at acknowledging the harm and advocating for change. That meeting 4 weeks ago and all of the collective organizing that's been done since showed me how we can exist in a space with one another to provide opportunities for support, the expression of righteous anger, and engage in collective action. I left feeling empowered alongside all those other feelings of fear and anger and sorrow. I hope you leave today with similar feelings of needing to take collective ongoing action to better support trans and gender diverse folks within and outside of social work education. And for our community of trans people in attendance today, I hope you leave feeling supported and as if you have a community behind you. We're glad you're here. Thank you again for being here today, Candace. I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Meg. I'm thrilled to be in this space today with all of you and really looking forward to a powerful, meaningful discussion. So I'm Candace Christensen. I'm an associate professor at the University of Texas, San Antonio. My research focuses primarily on violence prevention, which includes violence against queer communities. So I would like each of our panelists to introduce themselves, and I will go in alphabetical order. We will start with Ray Caballero.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Candace. Thank you all for having me. Again, my name is Ray Caballero Bijero, and I am a Filipino transgender man and also a social worker. I've been a social worker for about 8 years. I know I look very young, so it's been a little bit of time. And I'm here not affiliating myself with any organization or anything like that, but just speaking from my own experience. Thank you again.
And Ginger Chun.
Sorry, had to unmute myself. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here. My name is Ginger Chun. I am an MSW. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and professionally, I am the Education and Parent Outreach Manager at the Transgender Education Network of Texas, better known as TENT. And I am also the parent of an amazing transgender young adult who came out in transition during high school. And then I'm very involved in the community supporting families with trans youth.
And we have Ray Dooley.
Hi, everybody. I'm Ray. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. I am a social worker in private practice and a practice that I co-founded that primarily serves intersex, two-spirit, and other gender diverse folks. And before doing direct service, I actually did macro work. And so I also try to infuse some of that into my professional life now. So I also do organizational development work, training, and other initiatives to help improve material conditions for trans folks in all places where we exist.
And Sarah McHale.
Hi, everyone. I'm so grateful to be here. I am Sarah McHale. I use she, her pronouns. Currently executive director of Time Out Youth, an LGBTQ youth serving organization in Charlotte, North Carolina. I come to this space as a very impassionate social worker that I believe any of us that love social work are the biggest critics of the field. So I'm proud to be here talking about the work. I've also spent about 6 years as an adjunct professor at Hunter School of Social Work in NYU, my alma mater. So I'm really excited to come at this as an educator and as a social worker and program leader that cares very deeply for our trans young people.
Sarah Mounts.
Thank you so much. I'm so grateful and honored to be here, and thank you for having me. My name is Sarah Mounts, and I'm a faculty member at the University of Albany School of Social Welfare. For the past 2 decades, I've been working with systems impacted queer and trans young people as a practitioner, as a researcher who uses participatory action research, as an adult supporter of queer and trans youth organizers. I'm also the co-chair of the university's LGBTQ advisory board, and I do a lot of social justice focused work with our New York chapter of the National Association of Social Workers. So I interface with policy, anti-trans, either explicitly anti-trans, implicitly anti-trans, or affirming policy in a lot of different capacities. I'm so honored to be in conversation with everyone tonight.
And Darren Whitfield.
Good evening. My name is Dr. Darren Whitfield. I'm an associate professor at the University of Maryland, Baltimore School of Social Work. I identify myself as a cisgender co-conspirator of the rights movement for trans and non-binary community. And a lot of my research focuses on thinking about mental health and physical health disparities among LGBTQ communities. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, everybody, for introducing yourselves. We're very happy to have all of you here for this discussion. So now it's time for our first question, and this is open to all panelists. Social work education is uniquely positioned between the current reality of the field and the future of the field. As we think about this, what responsibilities do social work programs have to move us forward as more active agents of change in the face of transphobic policy and practice? Open to any speakers.
I guess I'll be the first to speak. I was hoping not to be the first to speak, but I think I've been pondering this first question for a while now. And actually, I think what I wanted to say is that I feel as a profession, we have sort of fallen in terms of our responsibility and our call to social justice and social activism. I think in the shift to be professional or seen as this professional association, we have really taken a backseat in terms of our call to be engaged in policy and engaged in activism and at the forefront and at the front of the line when we think about social justice. So particularly in this arena, I think our role and what we're called to do is to be better about, irrespective of area of practice, to be engaged in policy work from wherever our seat is. I mean, there is no, I don't understand how we've gotten here, honestly, right? It's not like these bills are new. It's not like these things just sprung up overnight. And yet we see ourselves sort of behind the eight ball. And I think part of that has to do with we no longer see social workers who are authoring legislation that really increases human rights and social justice for marginalized communities, right? We don't see social workers engaged in policy as a practice, you know, and I'm a clinician by training, but I also understand that being a clinician means that I have a responsibility to be advocating for policies that impact the clients I might serve on a daily basis. And we've forgotten that, right? I think we as a profession have truly forgotten that in a way that has been detrimental to our clients. We are no longer setting policy agenda in the way that we did in the first years of social work as being a profession, right? And I think that is where we need to be, and that is how we tackle, you know, these policies and this legislation that's coming, and not only in the cases that we know of now, but things that we all know are in the works. Is where are we by making sure it never gets to the floor, right? I want to challenge all of us to return to sort of activism social work and engage in all work that is social work from an activist perspective about what are we really doing to challenge and move things forward. So I'm going to stop there. but it's what I've been thinking about all week, sort of leading up to this, is like, how did we miss this?
I couldn't nod my head hard enough, so I needed to just jump in and say, Dr. Darren, I'm glad that you spoke first, because I think that that is so accurate. As someone who also went to a strictly clinical school and has taught at strictly clinical schools, there is a really problematic issue with the idea that social work is now just becoming a therapist and not thinking about the macro. Someone in the chat said they really like the macro micro integration, and I don't see a way to do one without the other. I say this to my young people all the time, like they don't want to sit in therapy when they don't know where they're sleeping that night. And that's largely my trans and non-binary young people that are impacted by that. So my team wouldn't be doing a good job if we were not also advocating for their basic needs while caring about their emotional health. I agree, social work is political. And I think because we've become like any professional organization that feels like we should be apolitical, I think that that is a strong problem that actually is part of our inception, which we need to recognize the roots of white supremacy. And all of the white social workers in the field have a responsibility to talk about abolishing the sort of police within the social work profession, because if we don't acknowledge it, then we won't present that. And I love social work so much and believe that we are really change agents, but that we need to acknowledge our history and how we can be different. And it shouldn't just be Black and brown and queer and trans social workers doing that. We actually need a call to action to our white colleagues to do that as well.
And I just would love to add, as a relatively recent graduate of an MSW program that purported to have a basis, basically a fundamental basis in cultural competency, that not every class necessarily fulfilled that goal. And in addition, we didn't stress advocacy and policy work enough. It was a very superficial examination of this work, especially when there are a lot of students coming in that have no idea what policy and advocacy work is. And just taking a really brief superficial look at it in a class, having somebody write a paper doesn't give them enough hands-on practice. So really encouraging students to get out there, provide the opportunities, really facilitate that opportunity for students to learn about policy and advocacy.
I will also just say, we are here because of the proliferation of absolutely egregious transphobic policy. And I really try to not get overwhelmed by this by sort of just like thinking about what I can do in my own corner. I think that it is true that social work schools have the capacity to model the kinds of environments, both from a built environment and policy perspective, where trans people could thrive. But right now, schools of social work, at least ones that I've encountered, are not doing that. They are actually a place where, rather than developing reserves among social workers to sort of like engage in these policy fights, social workers in training are traumatized and worn down. And so I think it's actually incredibly important that schools, again, be a place where folks develop both the skills and the reserve to do this really intense and incredibly important policy work. And that is not happening right now.
Just want to highlight that I echo so many of the things already said. When I think of the question, what responsibilities do social work programs have to move forward as active change agents? I think that it would do me a disservice to not speak bluntly and to not speak openly, given the amount of care and the amount of effort that went into organizing such an event. So I will share with love, as a fellow social worker, the ways that social work programs have failed trans and non-binary people are in all the ways. And I'm going to explain that a little bit more. So when I say the field of social work fails trans students, faculty, staff, and our constituents, we fail them when we prioritize upholding the current system as it is. When we prioritize our board of directors, our funders over the dignity and inherent worth of trans people. When we prioritize, uphold, and defend ideas, systems, and beliefs that are dangerous and harmful. When we create an exclusive system that does not meet the needs of every person that is experiencing homelessness in the world. When we don't meet the needs of the most vulnerable in whatever silo of social work you're in. I've been in housing and shelters the last 8 years. So like, if I'm not building a shelter that is inclusive for trans people, I'm not building a shelter, because I know statistically trans people are experiencing more. It's just, we have to look at the clear data that is there. People have done the work, by the way. We don't have to do our own data sometimes. So there's data that exists. We just got to look at it and have a really honest, transparent look at it. And that might mean having a difficult conversation with yourself, with your supervisor, with your board, with your funders, and I say this as someone who has done direct service work for so long, but is now doing state policy. Like it is possible to have these difficult conversations. Where you're just like, I echo so much of what Darren said of just the fear. And I think that like, there's a lot of cis people, right? Like y'all have privilege. So don't be afraid. What are you afraid of? Like, you gotta speak up for me, because I'm gonna be dead, man. Like, there's no other way.
I want to echo so much of what has been said. Like, my first 4 points have been ticked. I think we could be doing a much better job of preparing social work students to engage in legislative advocacy, to author legislation, to engage in coalitional work with folks who do this kind of work. I think we need to be doing a better job of preparing students to work in trans-affirming, anti-oppressive, anti-racist ways that acknowledge the community, family, and individual impact of violent policies on family and community well-being. And, Ray, I couldn't agree with you more that we need to look introspectively at how well we're doing as schools of social welfare in recruiting, retaining, affirming, supporting, celebrating our trans and non-binary students. And like you said, I think we're failing in so many of the ways. It's painful to watch. The last point I just wanted to make was that I think that we could do a better job than we currently do at supporting, centering, and collaborating with trans youth organizers. Trans and queer young people have always had incredible organizing capacity, and that's no different today. They know best what will keep them safe. Queer and trans youth of color were leaders in Stonewall and other uprisings that have led to gains for the broader LGBTQ community, yet they're often the first forgotten and least supported by LGBTQ communities themselves and by society more broadly. And I'm thinking of, because I'm in New York, queer and trans youth of color based organizations like Fierce New York City, like Breakout New Orleans. So really centering their work and following their lead and collaborating with them more meaningfully than I think we often do.
Thank you for sharing these insights.
Sorry, Candace, can I just say one more thing? Sorry, I'm gonna make this point, and I'm gonna do this because I have more privilege than other folks. And I'm gonna say that the first thing we need to do is recognize that our accrediting body, the Council on Social Work Education, has also failed all of the schools. We accredit schools who have clearly been hostile to trans and non-binary communities. And we do it under this guise that is, in my opinion, one of the most damning ways we possibly can. I think when we think about sort of what schools can do, right, they are beholden to the Council on Social Work Education. And that council has not held schools accountable for how we conduct education that is inclusive, respectful, and all of the ways that we need to. And so I think part of this conversation is how do we also think about the role of not individual schools, but also the Council on Social Work Education, because they're the ones that decide like if your school is accredited or not. And the factor of thinking about sort of that environment is not, and I've sat through accreditation, it does not get you dismissed. It will not be something that takes away your accreditation. And so I just think we really do need to think up long and hard about not only individual schools, but also calling out the council and saying like, where are we and how do we do a better job? And I'm gonna say, make that statement because of the privilege I have. And I also sit on one of the councils under the Council on Social Work Education, and we have failed completely.
Any other responses? Thank you for your thoughtful, impassioned, this wisdom on this topic, everybody. The chat's on fire. I mean, people are really feeling what you're saying. So our next question is for all of the panelists. Given those responsibilities we just discussed and opportunities to engage as agents of change, in what ways do you think the field of social work has failed trans students, faculty, staff, and our constituents? And what would it look like to rebuild trust?
I'll go ahead first, and I'll admit that I had to make a list for this one. Over the past 20 years, I've attended as a student or been a faculty member or been an adjunct instructor at half a dozen schools of social work. And so I've noticed kind of recurrent things that I wanted to note. I've seen some modest improvements, but overall, I'd say the majority of social work schools have failed to do kind of the bare minimum to support, recruit, affirm, support, and celebrate trans and non-binary students. So things I've observed repeatedly are a lack of visibility and just representation within curriculum materials. For example, much of our Hubsy foundational curriculum continues to center white, cis male, heteropatriarchal norms. Faculty are often ill-equipped to prepare students for affirming practice with queer and trans communities. Many of us lack language and comfort in talking about queer and trans communities. A surprising number of people still conflate sexual orientation and gender identity. Many misgender and otherwise microaggress against our trans and non-binary students, or don't interrupt microaggressions or facilitate healing when they happen in our classrooms. There's a lack of attention to the significant body of research demonstrating that gender affirming care and things like asserted pronoun use are associated with improved mental health outcomes and other markers of well-being. Failure to take seriously harmful and fixable institutional policies regarding names and pronouns. One thing that I've seen repeatedly at different institutions is trans students being pushed out of field because of failure to affirm students and or discomfort on the part of the agencies, with schools of social work too often failing to stand up for the student for fear of losing the agency as a placement. And then ultimately, because of that and the hostile school environment, I've seen us lose a lot of our trans and non-binary students, particularly those who are multiply marginalized, trans and non-binary students of color or students with disabilities. As Darren mentioned, at the national level, lack of robust support from our accrediting bodies, failure to take hard lines in condemning, for example, religious exemption from aspects of codes of ethics at faith-based schools of social welfare. Conferences plan to take place in some of the states with the worst legislative records in supporting anti-trans legislation. So I have a whole other bunch of thoughts on like, where do we even begin to reestablish trust? But I just had to make a mental list of the things that I'd seen at so many different institutions.
I like this question a lot. Because I, not to like destroy social work. I 100% wholeheartedly believe in social work, right? And like that's what I went to, and I'm still paying it off, right? But I think that rebuilding trust with trans communities, like whether you're cis or like straight or cis, it's possible. Like it's absolutely possible. And I think rebuilding that trust will definitely look like what I said earlier of managing your own personal ego and the ego of your agency to ensure you're not always responding from this place of personal criticism when you hear something against your agency. And don't hear it as in you are transphobic, but hear it as in, hey, I'm a trans person and I noticed this thing that maybe you haven't, noticed before because, you just don't have that point of view and I'm offering it to you. So just, take it as it is. And so just really learn to listen to trans people in whatever way that you provide criticism or whatever way you provide us the opportunity to give feedback. One, give us opportunities to give feedback anonymously. Two, when you're rebuilding trust, definitely do it at every level and do it intentionally and authentically. I can tell when an agency is coming to me because they need a grant, eligibility, LGBTQ 101 training checked off their list. And I can tell when another agency is coming to me and saying, I am really having a hard time, trying to adjust my shelter to be more open to trans people. Like I want to, I'm worried about safety. And like when people are coming to me in that way, I'm more open to really work with them and, really affirm that place they're coming from. So I guess just be really intentional and know that you just have to be real. You have to be real. And in this weird, like higher educational setting, I don't really like higher educational and like the weird white supremacy things that go along with that in general. So just keep in mind that privilege of where you're coming from.
I'm going to say the question again in case others want to jump in. So given our responsibilities within social work as agents of change, in what ways do you think the field of social work has failed trans students, faculty, and constituents? And what are ways we can rebuild trust?
No, please, Ray, go.
That's okay, after you.
I was just going to say, I think that the concept of rebuilding trust, we're even many years away from that. And we're not the ones to determine how trust will be rebuilt, right? When we transgress upon an entire community, it's not up for us to say whether we have absolved ourselves of all of the ways in which we've been complicit in the harm. So I think that social work as a field, given what everyone has said, has like a real issue with very baseline acknowledgement of our what we've done and engaged in as a profession that has caused harm for our communities, to our children, and to our, as stated, our young people that have been impacted across so many different ways. And someone, I think Rory in the chat, talked about something that was really like a great example of what I was going to say, is that we have to stop acting as though LGBTQ community is a special population and you can opt out of supporting us. And the social profession is so complicit in this idea that like the special population, or you don't have to learn to work with this group, as if we aren't everywhere and as if we aren't the ones that are the most impacted by the way in which our society harms. So to me, I think that before you even begin to talk about rebuilding trust, we need to do a whole lot of reckoning with the way in which we even include others. So teaching young social workers and hearing them say that I'm the first professor that ever asked their pronouns in the year of 2022 is just completely. Like, you see pronouns at the end of corporate organization signatures now. It's like cool, right? Like, it doesn't even mean anything anymore. And I'm being flip. It does matter. The point is, this is such a baseline like level of respect for including people. And we don't do that in social work schools. So where are we to even begin talking about trust when we're losing students, we're losing professionals that could be changing the face of white, cis, hetero social work, but we're not including them. So it's like, stop trying to recruit diverse people and make your profession more palatable for everyone to join. And same goes for organizations. Like, don't recruit a diverse team because it's the right thing to do and not have it set up where they can thrive.
That is a hard response to follow. I will just say, in thinking through this question myself, I really felt a lot of emotion come up because students are harmed in schools of social work in so many ways. And it felt to me really important to communicate that. And then I was like, there's no way I can communicate all of the ways in the amount of time we have. I will also say that I am a social worker and I am a person who was really harmed in a school of social work. It makes it incredibly hard to think about rebuilding trust when I see the same issues happening after me and know that they happened before me. I think that schools sometimes take advantage of the fact that both undergraduate, master's, and PhD students cycle through, and that creates sort of fractures in collective history and collective memory. I think that there are not currently, I think this is a bit of a cliche, but one of the best ways to apologize is to change your behavior. And schools really are not doing that. And not only are they not doing that, but they are in no way engaging in real processes of accountability and reconciliation. And in some ways I get that, right? Because those are these two buzzwords that it's really hard to know how to actually put into practice. But I think just like the lack of effort to even do that is really fostering prolonged distrust. I'll also just say that I think that there's a real problem with a narrative about scarcity in social work. In particular, one of the ways that I see this come up is that we talk about particularly like undergrad and master's students doing field placements and say like, there are so few field sites. Aren't we so lucky that we have these sites? And because of that, we actually don't hold sites where students experience great harm and just harm beyond misgendering. But I mean, like that harm and harm far beyond that. We do not hold those sites accountable because we have a narrative of scarcity. And so until some of that changes, it will be hard to rebuild trust.
So I want to first start off by saying sorry on behalf of my colleagues, on behalf of the profession, on behalf of the academy, for the harm that's been done and continues to be done. I also want to uplift something that was said, which is two things actually. One, being able to take hard lines and also not being able to opt out. So when I say taking hard lines, I'm referring to, Ray, what you just spoke to, which is so often we, in schools of social work, particularly in field, don't listen or turn a deaf ear to the experience of trans and non-binary students in field because we don't want to lose an agency. And I feel like we need to start taking hard lines. We cannot put students in harm's way. It's not only against our values, as a profession, it is against the values and the morals of being in the academy itself, right? And so I think we need to start holding agencies accountable, right, for the harm that they've done, and not only not place students there, but also part of that reconciliation and rebuilding is thinking about what is our job and then helping them to understand what the problems are and how do we be agents of helping them develop solutions and to be able to repair the harms that they do. So I think we have to really take some hard lines, right? It was said, Sarah had mentioned earlier about we accredit programs. We need to take some hard lines on these things. I mean, we can't keep sort of doing this performative thing, right? Where we hire someone to do diversity and equity and inclusion, or we do all of these trainings, or we talk about all this stuff, we hold these sessions and it's performative, and then we go in the classroom and we misgender someone. I mean, we need to really start holding ourselves accountable for what we've done and take some hard lines. And then the only thing I just wanted to mention here was also that and that we have not only failed students, we also have failed colleagues. So I think we unfortunately, right, we think about the harms we've done to students, but we don't think about the harm we've inflicted on our colleagues. And it is a two-way street, right? So the harms that are experienced by students in schools of social work are absolutely experienced by faculty and staff at schools of social work too. And it is that harm that I think also goes unrecognized because we are, pieces of the machine sometimes.
Would anyone else?
Yeah, I just have, sorry. I think everybody, everybody's really well covered all of the issues. And the only thing I want to add is holding students accountable, because I have seen so many incidences where students engage in microaggressions and say awful things in class sessions, and professors or fellow students don't call them out. I do not know why that happened, or, I don't quite understand the dynamics, except that I think that maybe professors are not necessarily always very well educated on the topics. But allowing students, it's very similar to allowing schools that are holding particular beliefs engage in exemptions on guidelines. Allowing students who may have particular beliefs kind of throw out those exemptions as excuses is also an issue that really creates an uncomfortable environment for fellow students, and then lets that student go out to become a social worker and engage in those microaggressions as a professional.
I just want to add to what Ginger said, that we have resources that are free and publicly available, multiple resources, right? By the CSOG Council, within the Council on Social Work Education, they've created guidelines for transgender and gender nonconforming affirmative education. They've created a whole framework name of how to approach and engage with microaggressions that occur in the classroom. So the tools are here. Folks, particularly cis folks, need to be engaging with them. Something I see is the burden of education being placed on trans and non-binary students, which takes away from their opportunities to be learners, which is emotionally taxing, which is traumatizing. So leadership within schools of social work, I think, also need to be holding faculty, professional staff, instructors accountable for familiarizing themselves with these resources that really are very instructive for folks who just feel like they're not sure where to start.
Again, a rich discussion on this topic. And Kes, thank you for posting a link to those recommendations. Here is our third question, and this is particularly for Ray and Ray, but certainly we would like to hear from others on this one. How do we take this labor off the shoulders of trans and non-binary people while also ensuring their voices and experiences are centered?
So I'll just start with the caveat that I am speaking for myself in this answer. I believe that this question is asking about allyship. For myself, it is my perspective that I do not want to stop doing this work because it is about my survival. And so that does not feel optional to me, and that does not feel like something that I want other people to take on. What I do feel, though, is that we need to be creating systems of support around trans people so that trans folks can continue to do this work. We need to stop asking trans folks to do work that has already been done. We need to be compensating trans people for this work. And we actually really need trans people in positions of leadership, because it is incredibly dangerous to do this work when you are in a position with the least power within any school, agency, or other setting. And so for this reason, it's absolutely incredibly important that we are giving trans folks money and formal power so that we can continue to do this work that is about our survival. And that I personally would like to keep holding responsibility for.
One thing that comes to mind is a lot of what Ray has shared. And I think another way to take labor off of trans and non-binary people's shoulders is just by having so many of us at the table. I want like so many trans people at the table that like I just like disagree with so many of them, because right now when I see like when another trans person identifies themselves as trans, it's just me and them in a room of like hundreds of cis social workers. Usually it's only me, unless, but of course like only if people are like open, like things like that. But yeah, I just want a lot of us out here. I need a lot of us out here. And when I say a lot of us out here, I mean, give people the agency to one, work at your agency. So give them the opportunity to work at your agency. That might mean looking at your hiring practices, because we know that trans people don't have access to higher education. I actually don't have an MSW. Like I lead a state program, but I don't have an MSW. Trans people don't have access to higher education. So maybe you don't need to be requiring MSWs for job positions. Maybe you need to be recruiting from HBCUs. Maybe you need to be looking at things differently than how you're doing right now. Give us the opportunities to speak up, but also don't expect us to. Don't, tokenize folks. I was the state of Virginia's tokenized trans person traveling across the state, doing my trans thing, being the trans man. But that work is taxing and that work is difficult, and that leads to very quick burnout. And so I say we can take labor off of trans people by, if you bring so many of us to the table, we're able to support each other and we're able to tap each other in and out. It's great to have one trans person, that is like the bare minimum. Like, please be bringing as many diverse people as you can with different education backgrounds, racial backgrounds, political backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds, like all of those things.
Would any other panelists like to make comments or ask questions?
I just want to echo what Ray said, that in my experience as the parent of a trans person, that I was often the only person in the class that had any experience with the transgender experience. And it wasn't even my personal experience, right? So I feel like faculty and staff in social work programs need to be well educated on the topic so that they're not relying on their students to educate them or educate their classmates. It's just inappropriate that that a trans person should ever be put on the spot to be educating their fellow students. And I mean, obviously, I feel as it was my role as a cis person to certainly get some information out there, and it wasn't a burden on me. So that's okay, I guess. But when I know more than my professor, I feel like that's a little bit of an awkward, uncomfortable position. And I definitely think schools need to make the effort to educate professors, especially probably more senior tenured professors that may not have any knowledge.
I also just want to uplift this, the notion that was said about having so many in a room that you can disagree with each other. I mean, that's very real. When we think about trans and non-binary faculty across this country, can we come up with a list, right? I mean, that's a problem, right? We are not pipelining the way that we should be non-trans and non-binary social workers to be in places and seats of power, as was mentioned. And so, I guess this goes back to question number 1 and question number 2, but like, where is the pipelining occurring? How do we begin to think about hiring practices, but also thinking about how do we nurture students who are very talented and have so much to give to the profession so that they one day are sitting behind the desk where I sit currently, right? I mean, there's enough of me sitting around a table. We need other folks. We need to expand that. And I think that it also is related to pipelining as well. So I just wanted to uplift that to say not just students, but the tenure of faculty is appalling.
I just want to acknowledge the courage you all are expressing in this discussion and really value the structural analysis, like getting at the root cause of these issues. So thank you. I'm going to move us to our next question. We are seeing a national backlash related to many social and racial justice issues. How do you see the rise of anti-trans policies and rhetoric functioning in this space, in this backlash? And how can we ensure our work is at the intersection of supporting BIPOC, disabled, immigrant, youth, older adults, and other transgender, non-binary, marginalized people? This is for all panelists.
So I have a very simple answer to this because it's very simple. We need to be reminded and conscious of that everyone has an intersectional identity, right? You cannot be one without the other. That is not how our lives work. And so to show up in these spaces is to also remember that trans and non-binary folks occupy those identities as well. I think for so long, the system of power has kept us in its place by this narrative that we are somehow separate and desperate when we're all the same, right? I think, right, so many famous people have said, right, injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere, and so forth and so forth. But thinking about and being mindful that, oppressive structures, policies, institutions do not target groups in isolation or in silos. And so the marginalization of immigrants, the marginalization of persons living with disability is the marginalizations of trans and non-binary folks. You can't have one without the other. It doesn't work that way, right? To stand up and say Black Lives Matters also means to stand up and say that trans lives matters, that folks living with disabilities matter, that et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And I think that as social work and social work education, what we do is we need to be better about teaching from an intersectional lens. You know, how often are we truly engaging in discussions about, so when you have a client sitting in front of you, how are you attending to them? That question means how you are attending them from an intersectional perspective. And also then how, and we talk in policy classes about social movements. Well, how are we talking about social movements? How are we talking about our place around advocacy, right? Because to do advocacy for our group is to do it from an intersectional perspective, right? And policy change requires intersectional perspective around how those policies impact. And so it's a very simple answer. It is hard to implement, but it is a simple answer, right? We all have intersectional identities, and we have to be mindful and operate from that perspective all the time when we're thinking about engagement and social action.
Thank you so much for that, Darren. And I wanted to also bring that back to the anti-trans legislation, because I think one of the things we're seeing that was probably one of the catalysts for this convening is instances of state systems and apparatuses like CPS and schools being weaponized against trans youth, their family, and affirming providers. I have a few things to say about that. The first is that the idea that trans youth might be safer in these systems than with their affirming families is presented as protecting children. And in some cases, such as sports, it's in the name of protecting cis women, when in actuality, it's an effort to regulate families and to police and eradicate bodies and identities. And I think it's really important that in having this conversation, we recognize the violence intrinsic to some of these systems that was ready for weaponization or has been weaponized historically. The ways in which these same strategies have been used against families and communities of color, particularly Black and Indigenous families, for forever, beginning or including but not ending with Indian boarding schools, that multiply marginalized trans youth and families, such as youth and families of color, are always the most impacted by these attacks, and that violent policy is connected to constituted systems of oppression. So that Governor Abbott's order in Texas is very much connected to challenges we're seeing against ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act. They're not separate, and that both seek to uphold white supremacist, cis heteropatriarchal power. So I think we can also draw linkages between these pieces of violent legislation. And I saw a question earlier about our complicity in state systems that perpetrate violence, state-sanctioned violence that terrorize families and communities. And I do think we need to create spaces within social work to interrogate our weddedness to those systems and what alternatives might be possible.
I just want to highlight so much of what Dr. Darren has shared, especially the part of just, I don't know, for me, like I'm just going to speak for myself again. And so I am like a Filipino trans man, right? So now I'm looking at the question, not only as like me as a social worker in serving other trans people, but like me as just a human being. Like, what support do I need from the social work program? Oof. I would say your work supports me when I am safe. Your work supports me when I don't have to edit who I am. Your work supports me when there are other people that look like me at the table. And your work supports me when you say our agency supports mental health and then you actually offer paid mental health days off. Your agency supports me when the agency has health insurance that covers transgender medical needs. Your agency supports me when leadership can see my anger as a trans person and not dismiss and devalue it, but turn it into something that can be helpful for my clients and my people. So it is impossible for me to separate like, oh, you're only, when I go to the post office and I like get something mailed, like the mailman is helping not just half of me. Like the mailman might not know that they're helping a trans person, but I'm trans everywhere I go. I'm not just trans, like, I mean, it's not a choice. It's not a choice for me. So whether you are acting as a social worker or as a human being, like I just need to feel safe, and I want my friends to be safe.
And as a social worker who's currently working in Texas and working to fight some of these policies and obviously what's going on with AG Paxton and the governor, we have had a lot of discussions among the social workers about like the risk we're putting to our licensing. And so that's like some discussion that needs to happen about like why a state agency might have so much power over licensing issues. And really, I mean, it does create fear for all social workers and for students if when they are wanting to act out and fight against policies that they might be putting their livelihood at risk. So I don't know how that it kind of relates, but yeah.
Would anyone else like to comment or respond? Okay. I very much appreciate lifting up intersectionality and how all of this has happened before and it's continuing to happen, the role of history in what's happening right now. So thank you. Here is the next question. More and more social worker activists and advocates are talking about the moral injury of being trained to live into a set of guiding values related to equity and justice, while being financially dependent upon employment that puts them in situations where harm is being done to them and their clients. How do you see this related to anti-trans policies in your own spheres of social work? Let's start there.
So I will speak to some trends that I've noticed in my corner of North Carolina. So I had the privilege to be a part of a group of folks who did an analysis of the impact on trans people of North Carolina's House Bill 2, which was sort of like one of the earlier and like particularly egregious pieces of anti-trans legislation. And so we know now both from trans people who share their lived experience and from those who did so in that data collection process that these bills, in fact, are, yes, incredibly harmful for trans folks, both in terms of threatening our safety directly and in terms of sort of like constantly being exposed to discourse about our own humanity. So that is real. And like, yes, we do have data about that. So these anti-trans policies we found in this evaluation create an incredibly acute set of mental health needs among trans folks. And then we're also in a situation where like some of the harm that trans folks experience in their social work training programs actually kind of lead them to conclude that being a part of agencies and institutions will not work for them, that there will not be space for them there and they will not be able to thrive. And so we see a lot of trans folks now in North Carolina going directly into private practice, as I did myself. And so that means a couple of things. It means that we don't have trans folks in systems to help respond to these really acute needs, and that often folks in private practice are left to do it when we don't have the institutional support that we need, given the level of acuity that we see. It also means that trans providers are in positions where we don't have access to health insurance, paid family leave, paid sick leave, et cetera. And so I just kind of want to connect all of these things and talk about the link that I see between the real harm that these policies do, and then the funneling of trans folks, trans clinicians into private practice and away from agencies.
I also just want to lift up something that Ray said earlier around employing, like the idea that like we're in a profession where we're called to these ethics and justice. We're both asking our peers to be accountable to those, right? We started the conversation with how do we hold our peers accountable to the social justice elements of social work. And then we're working in places trying to recruit queer and trans people, but not offering healthcare, not offering inclusive family leave, not offering those things. And so speaking to that piece about being needing employment and then having to uphold things, but your organization, like in queer organizations, I've worked in largely queer organizations, and there's still been abysmal policy for healthcare within organizations that are actually helping our community. So to the point about like, I'm queer wherever I go, it means when I show up at work and I need a doctor, it doesn't matter that I am a leader of, like now I can make some change, right, as a leader of a queer organization. And that is why I wanted to lead an organization, because I want to do the things better than what I've seen done before. In my small piece of North Carolina, I hope to do that. But also, that's not where real change is going to happen. It will impact the 10 people that work with me and potentially make changes for the youth. What's missing from this for me, and my entire passion working with youth started in the foster care space because of the way that we treat young people, hasn't gone away. And for every way in which we are negatively impacted, our young people feel that, and they are getting it even worse because we are at least in the position of being employed, right? So to me, I think that that parallel process, bringing us back to our favorite social work terms, like that to me is so meaningful. And my queer young people care about me as a person. They see me as a queer person, and they see me as a queer leader. And that is really special. And when we turn away and we don't create inclusive workspaces, and we don't include policy that allows people on my team to flourish and thrive, then they're dimmer and they're not as good at their job. And then we don't help more people. And then what the hell are we doing here? Because it's certainly not for the money. So I think that there's so much that's missing there, and we do have a part, right? Like I learn about the concept of like where our points of change are. So for me, they're quite high, right? I have options as a leader. Where is your point of making change, and where is your level of accountability, and where can you make that happen? And again, calling back to allies and making sure that I show up for my trans and non-binary siblings and peers and colleagues and take on labor the way that I want people, my cis counterparts and straight counterparts, to do that for me, so that I don't, I'm not even more exhausted at the end of the day than I already am.
So I was thinking about this from the academy, the seat that I sit in, and I want to directly make this correlation back to these bills, right? These bills were founded, one, on peer hatred, let's be honest about that, but also two, under the guise of research and the guise of best practices for mental health. So now I'm going to make this threat to the Academy about how we have been complicit in that. We, in the Social Work Academy, uphold the DSM as if it is something to be proud of. It is not. In the latest iteration of the DSM, we did not get rid of gender dysphoria as a way to then think about introduction of therapy for trans and non-binary folks. So one, we need to not rely on the DSM and use it as one of many tools from a critical lens, understanding that it has been a weapon in legislation, but also a damning tool in the treatment of trans and non-binary folks, in addition to other marginalized communities. So one, first answer around that. Two, as an academic, right, we engage in research. Much of this research has been on the backs of communities of color and trans and non-binary folks without them actually then benefiting from that research. So we need to address this, right? So I think it calls for us to recondition and think about community-centered research. I don't want to talk about community participatory research. I want to talk about community-centered research that not only promotes and uplifts and supports members of the community, but becomes opportunities for them to have gainful employment that leads to them having the credentials necessary to enter the academic pipeline. And so as I think about the Academy and how it's directly translated to these bills coming up, it is through the guise of research and the guise of what is considered best mental health practices. And we've been complicit and continuing to use these tools, which have continuing led to bills being introduced. Whereas if we would start engaging in ethical social work, right, we would produce things that is the counter narrative to these decades of the narrative that the Academy has ownership in.
Would anyone else like to respond? This brings us to our final question, where we get to action steps. We hope to end this town hall with clear action steps for social work education and social workers more broadly. Before we move into the Q&A, can each of the speakers share one or two things they think are critical in moving social work and social work education to more truly living our values in light of oppressive and harmful policies and rhetoric towards trans people?
Well, I'll throw out one thing, which is creating real life learning experiences for students in programs. And that is making the opportunity for social work students to do field work in organizations like, for example, my own. We've been basically through assistance from my local university, we are actually going to be able to take on a social work intern at Transgender Education Network of Texas. But there are so many organizations that don't have a social worker on staff, and it would be amazing if universities could really work harder to facilitate the liaisons and the support systems for organizations that are out there doing the work to educate our students.
I think the one thing that comes to mind as a clear action step for how folks can, truly help lift up trans people is just by using whatever privilege you have to bring trans folks up to your level. But I hear that a lot of folks are already thinking about that, and that's incredible. So I just recommend folks to keep thinking about it. And that's about it, just because I am pretty tired in being the only trans person in all the social work spaces for 8 years. Come on, y'all. Like there's more, but we just have to support them, and the ways that we support trans people, that could be a whole other thing. But just bring folks up to your level.
I'd like to echo that and add onto it a little bit. I think it's incredibly important for trans social workers in training, whether at the macro or direct practice level, to have really good supervision. And there is a lack of supervisors who have both the kind of competency in either clinical or macro work and trans competency. And so this is an area where both trans and cis people can have a really big impact. And we're really talking about sustainability of our efforts here, and of not taxing the queer and trans supervisors who are already out there doing this work for so many students and so many social workers in training, that they're holding up a responsibility in a way that, again, just isn't sustainable. I will also just say, kind of like a shameless plug, I have a really big dream about creating a pretty intensive training program specifically for both cis and trans clinicians who want to be able to do work with trans populations. This is something that should exist in schools of social work and doesn't. And so I would like to make it, and I don't really have the money to do that. So if there's anybody on this call who is interested in a project like this, and especially if you're attached to an institution that has resources to make it happen, I would love to connect with you.
I think a lot of the things that we started talking about in the beginning, that Dr. Whitfield so poignantly brought us to, which is to keep in line the idea that advocacy is integral to any of the work that we do, whether you're an academic, you're a clinician, you're working in program space. So I think a real action step is leading our peers, our clients in that space, so that we cannot be ignored, and we're a loud group. I also think that something that I've learned well from young people that I've worked with is that we need to stop speaking for them and create spaces at the table for them to speak. Something I loved about social work when I started almost 20 years ago was like, I can speak up for others that don't have a voice, and then quickly learned, but maybe not quickly enough, that everyone has a voice, but some people are silenced, so that we need to stop speaking for others and give them the space to speak, particularly when it doesn't impact us. So where do we learn the line between allyship and stepping back, and using, as Ray said, whatever privilege we have to do that well? And that is a sort of point of change we can make on a daily basis, and that we don't allow people to harm our peers. I think the other Ray mentioned how many people are harmed, including yourself as a professional, and I want to be a witness to that and say that I hate that is your experience, and I validate it and believe that we all have a role in also what Ginger said. As a professor, I found it my duty to, whenever someone used language wrong or said something that could be harmful to any community, whether I was a part of it or not, I felt that so important, because I've been the person sitting in the room where no one said anything about the comment, and it had such an impact on me. So again, the areas where I have an option to do it, and I have blind spots because there are communities that I'm missing. So for me, those are things that we can do on a daily basis. And if we love social work, we need to be the ones to change it.
So I'm gonna take us back. So, I love social work. All of my degrees are in social work. I spent my entire professional career as a social worker. And I'm also always reminded that when I was an undergrad, my professor told me that in the field of social work, the professional is the personal. You don't get the option to compartmentalize in this field. And what that means then is that social workers need to liberate our professional organizations from transphobic attitudes, policies, practices, and procedure that leads to transphobic policies, practices, and procedures, including holding universities accountable for inaction. I think for far too long, the response has been nothing. And that is the change that I think we need to make, is to hold schools accountable for the harms that they have done. Unfortunately, hearing about them today from two of my panelists and knowing about them from students. And I truly believe, I sort of started this by talking about policy, but we need to be engaged in policy, and we need to be engaged in policy internally and externally as a profession. As my mother would say, you need to clean your house before you try and clean someone else's.
Thank you, Darren. Building on that, one of the two things recommendations I felt strongly about were that I feel like every school of social welfare, given everything we've heard tonight, given all the things we've heard from students, should conduct an audit of their program for how well they're doing in supporting, affirming, retaining their trans and non-binary students, staff, and faculty. And again, we have tools that are free and publicly available, such as the best practices issued by the CSOG Council that could be used to conduct that audit. And then I think those results need to be made public as a form of accountability for how schools are doing. So that was my first one. My second one was a little bit different and has to do with the fact that I'm so deeply situated within child welfare. I just want to go back to the conversation about Texas and CPS as a weapon against affirming families of trans and non-binary youth, and acknowledge the complexity of this situation. So there's a lot of realities to acknowledge here. One is that it's ridiculous that the child welfare system could be safer than an affirming family. And that affirming trans youth is child abuse. Simultaneously, LGBTQ youth are overrepresented in the child welfare system, and sadly, trans and binary youth are disproportionately targeted for various forms of violence, including in their home. So how do we reconcile all this? How do we talk about this? Based on like having been a practitioner and doing a lot of work with young people with foster care experience, queer, trans, or not, I can say that a lot of youth who experience foster care do not have good outcomes. That system does not do well by them for many of them. For trans youth, the experiences they have are particularly egregious. And so I think we need to, and thinking about how do we address this fact that, trans and non-binary young people are sometimes being harmed in their home, knowing that CPS and the child welfare system has acted in really violent ways towards many different communities. And so I just wanted to ask or manifest or dream that we create spaces for imagining supports and responses that can exist outside of state systems. And that support communities. And I just wanted to share two examples. One is the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective, which uses pods and pod mapping as a way of building community capacity to respond among people in our own communities, broadly understood. in terms of whom we might turn to if we're experiencing harm, rather than initiating or deepening involvement in systems that often cause even more harm. And then I also just wanted to lift up a program called Avenues for Youth. It's a host home program in Minneapolis. Sarah looks like she's heard of it before. And they draw on the long history of mutual aid within queer and trans communities by having adults volunteer to provide safe and affirming community-based housing for LGBTQ young people over the age of 16 within their community of choice. It operates completely outside of the system. So, there are no perfect alternatives, but I do think we need some space to be introspective, to reimagine, to have choices, and again, to really interrogate our weddedness and complicity with state systems.
I believe that brings us to a close today. I want to thank all of the panelists for a critical, courageous, radical discussion, getting at the root problems of these oppressive issues we're facing. I'm going to turn the time over to Alex Wagaman for our Q&A session.
Thank you, Candace. Good evening, everyone. Yeah, I have just been over here just soaking it in, and we started off with some serious fire and have just continued with that. I hope that for those of you on the panel who haven't been able to see the chat, hope you'll be able to take a second to look at it and just see how your words are uplifting and affirming a lot of what people are experiencing and looking for and wanting to demand of our profession. I want to just maybe pull together some threads from the Q&A and some things that have already been brought up, and starting with the first question in the Q&A, building on what Dr. Mounts just talked about related to thinking outside of what we maybe have traditionally thought of as what practice looks like, or the spaces where we should be practicing. The first question is related to our curriculum and redefining curriculum. And some of you have named some specific skills and practices, but I wanted to maybe open it up for any other thoughts about what would the things that you all have called for in this conversation, what would it require of our curriculum as social work educators and social work programs? What kinds of skills and knowledges do we need to be thinking about if we're redefining curriculum? What are your thoughts about that?
So I think part of this is the idea that we see trans and non-binary folks, as someone mentioned earlier, as special populations in curriculum, as we see all LGBTQ folks as special populations in curriculum. And the way that we need to restructure that is thinking about how do we integrate trans and non-binary folks across the curriculum, both in generous social work courses and also in advanced courses. I mentioned earlier about the DSM, and I just think that it's a horrible tool for us to still be using as a profession. And I think though, if we are going to use it, because I do understand some of my clinical colleagues are probably like having heart attacks, I think we also need to then use the WPATH standards for transgender care in addition, and teach that complementary. So I think if we're going to use some of these archaic and very problematic tools and skills in social work education, we need to teach those alongside things that are critical and alongside things that were written for and by trans and non-binary folks and also people of color. I mean, I think that's where I will start and stop, is like, we need a refresh in some very real ways.
This is a fairly general point, but I also think that there's just much about social work curricula, both for macro and direct practice students that doesn't actually resonate with trans people themselves. Like many of the sort of more dominant clinical paradigms, for example, like just are not culturally resonant in trans communities. And so sure, we need to do a better job of teaching everyone how to work with trans communities in a way that isn't just sort of like eliciting pity or increasing stigma, but we also actually need to make curricula that resonate with real living trans people who are sitting in classrooms.
One thing that I would love to see in social work curriculums as someone that might come back one day is I would love to see maybe just like a history of queer and trans folks, maybe like history of queer and trans activists or advocates, social workers, maybe history of trans policies in your state, maybe history of federal trans policies. Also, really highlight the fact that there are and always have been, you know, queer and trans people of color, Black and brown people from the beginning of time, and we will continue to exist. But so, you know, get some representation when you do those trans history of trans people, like timelines. So, and yeah, just, you know, try and get representation in there.
Yeah, and to that point, I also think, and also echoing Dr. Whitfield's points around archaic tools, a lot of social work curriculum doesn't change, and we can still maintain the history of the work while changing it and making it more inclusive. I, you know, went to school in New York and taught in New York where there's LGBTQ policy classes. With that does not mean that LGBTQ people are absent from every other class that you're in. Like, it's like all spaces, right? I am very pro things that are specific to our community, and we need to queer the rest of the curriculum, because guess what? We're also in all of the other topics that are being talked about. So that's something I've seen, having graduated with my MSW in 2008 to teaching 14 years later, some parts of the curriculum and things, the research is old. And I know many of you are writing this research, you are doing this work. Some of my favorite social work professors are putting out amazing research, and it's not making it into curriculum unless it's a queer specific classroom. And that is just not the way to be inclusive in talking about human behavior and the way that we talk about policy and all of those things. You shouldn't have to take an LGBTQ policy class to learn about LGBTQ policy. You should learn about it in policy in general.
And I would just want to echo what somebody said earlier, which is not lumping in gender diversity with sexuality and really pulling that T out of the LGBTQ plus, because it's a very unique and different experience. And I don't think a lot of people understand that. So it just all gets lumped in together and throughout the curriculum, because you're right, it's not a special population, it's humanity.
Sorry. No, you first.
Yeah, sorry. I wanted to add one more point, which is that I think that this is also a really critical conversation at the PhD level in schools of social work. You know, we do not teach PhD students how to collect and analyze data in a way that represents sort of like the full diversity of the universes of genders out there. And so this actually like kind of creates a feedback loop that's a real problem, because while data can be weaponized, data is also power. And so if we don't create scenarios where we're able to get data on trans experience, that leads to funding, that leads to resources, et cetera, then we are perpetuating a real problem.
We were synced up. I was about to say the uncritical way in which gender binarism gets reproduced through kind of the way in which research is uncritically shared, dichotomous understandings of gender. I also wanted to point out one other thing about the explicit curriculum, and then two things about the implicit curriculum. And again, there are like 1,000 things that could be pointed out. But going back to the idea that we have these practices at our disposal, why don't we teach them? We could be teaching family acceptance work in our practice classes. We know that moderately or mildly rejecting families often have some malleability, and we could be working with them around becoming more accepting of trans and queer youth in ways that could be life-saving, right? Or harm reducing. But I don't see a lot of that content getting taught. A couple of things about the implicit curriculum, and I do feel like I'm probably speaking to the choir, so I hesitate to even name some of these things, but clearly marked and accessible and known gender inclusive restrooms that aren't in the basement or some corner of the building, right? Establishing and enforcing clear procedures for the use of gender affirming names and pronouns in class via email on printed materials, right? Like some of these things seem like basic. We've known them for a really long time, but they're still not happening. And then just finally, in terms of that pipeline Dr. Whitfield was talking about, I think having affirming recruitment and application process. So a lot of our application materials are off-putting, right? They're still binaristic in the way that they ask about gender. Our letters of acceptance often use gendered honorifics, where students are misgendered, right? Like as they're being accepted before they've even walked in the door. And that's really off-putting. Given known disparities in access for resources, thinking about cost access of applying to schools. So just some of those things that, again, like I'm probably preaching to the choir, but I felt like it might be worthwhile for someone who catches this recording and like wants to use it to name them.
And Sarah, I just want to, because I want to just grab on the last thing you just said. Not only do we need to rethink about those admissions process, but also who is scoring and reviewing the admission materials, because oftentimes, I won't tell stories, but oftentimes you hear things in the room which basically suggest that like you're not getting in, and you do coded things and say it in a coded way, but it's because of how we have uplifted and continue to perpetuate this heteropatriarchy norm around what a good social work student's application looks like.
Thank you all. There is another question I really wanted to go back to, and I think that again, Sarah Mounts talked about this earlier about the relationship between the rhetoric and the state and state-sanctioned violence. And Luca asked the question related to, do we actually see ourselves as a profession being able to move away from this relationship with the state? And while I don't want to complicate it, I also want to lift that we've named a couple of other institutions that we are also bound up in. We mentioned, I think Ginger mentioned the licensing system and boards. Dr. Darren mentioned our accrediting body, and other folks, I think Ray talked about funders. There are lots of ways that we as a profession are kind of bound up in the state. And so I'm wondering about folks' responses to that, about the seeing it as possible and what would that require. I know Sarah Mounts already talked a little bit about other models, but some action steps that folks see as being ways that we can move in that direction.
in the work that I do, I don't think there's an option. Whether it's possible or not is sort of irrelevant. It's imperative that we separate, because where I work, the young people, the queer trans community, from ages 13 to 24, want absolutely nothing to do with anything that represents law enforcement, a police state in general. And they also have a hard time trusting social workers because of our connection and because of the ways in which our profession polices them in other ways. And they know that. And so for me, my organization's really explicit separation from working with the state makes us better at our jobs, because it means that our young people trust us more, and that we then look to community to find ways to not resort to that, because there's just no world in which we can say that that our being entwined in police state is not us being complicit in violence to our most impacted peers and clients. Again, I don't want to only make this about our clients. We are negatively impacted and targeted. And if we are looking out for our communities and our allies to our Black peers and clients, then we are in no way, to the point that was made earlier, that you can't say that I'm supportive of this group, but then you're taking money or being a part of something that is actively harming trans people. The same can be said for being intertwined in the police state. So to me, we don't need to talk about whether it's possible. We need to do it and see it as an actual professional imperative.
So I'm gonna do some shameless promotion, and Sarah's smiling because she is also on this piece. So a few of us have actually written an article about anti-carceral social work and provided some concrete steps in thinking about how do we engage in anti-carceral social work and what that looks like. So I had the pleasure of working on that with Dr. Sarah Mound, and that's led by Dr. Leah Jacobs and some other fabulous, wonderful colleagues. And so I'm happy to share that if someone does not have access to that article. I can't remember the title off the top of my head, but we'll get it to folks.
Defund the police.
Yes, thank you.
So this work is absolutely imperative, and I'll just sort of take it back to like modeling what we are hoping to accomplish beyond social work, and just say that we in social work need to get much better at practices of accountability and reconciliation and restorative justice. And so it's incredibly important that we divest ourselves from the carceral state. And it is also incredibly important that we do the really hard work of modeling alternatives so that we are then able to bring them beyond our profession.
I will say that I am aware that we don't all, like, we may all feel the same way, but nationally as a profession, as a discipline, we don't all feel the same way. So I think one of the questions was, is it possible for us to move in that direction? I do feel like there's a groundswell. I feel like, you know, more people are identifying as abolitionists, social workers or social work educators, anti-carceral. But I think there's also pushback and resistance and, like, you know, real belief that among some folks that we should continue to collaborate in really traditional ways with law enforcement. And so I don't know, I have this dream that in 10 years, in 15 years, social work's going to be completely unrecognizable to me in all the best ways because of this groundswell, and that I am steeped in it. But I just do want to acknowledge that that's, like, you know, contentious. But that will win.
I think also those people, those social workers who are able to make challenges to things like threats against their licensing. I mean, it's a privileged group of people that probably can do that, but those social workers should be willing to take that risk. And I mean, we've discussed that at my organization because the work we do is, I mean, as a social worker, I'm threatened because of the work we do. So yeah, so those people who are in the position where they can actually take those risks and fight against those threats should definitely do so.
I want to ask if we have time for one more question from the chat, and then I wanted to, in the spirit of the young people that I work with, I want to end with thinking about where we can find connection, community, and joy. But before we get to that, there is a question, a really specific question about concrete steps that social work students can take to fight anti-trans policy while also protecting our own safety as trans and non-binary social workers working in states with policies like those in Texas. So any concrete steps that folks would like to suggest?
So I'm going to say this, and my colleagues at UMB will have a discussion probably about this tomorrow, but I think the young folks and students should demand that their faculty do it with them and really hold universities accountable for doing it with them, right? I don't think that we should be asking students to do work that we're not willing to do ourselves. And we are in places of power, right? Like, I probably will not lose my job if I decide to go out and engage in activism. And I probably won't experience the level of harm that my students would. And so I think that students, the first step is to demand that their universities and schools of social work be engaged in that work with them, to protect them and to also model the way of activism and social work.
I think also connecting with coalitions of people that are working against these policies, because then you're protected by a group of people. So in Texas, for example, I bring it up a lot because I'm here. We have a huge coalition of people working together against the policies that are currently attempting to be implemented. And yeah, so you can they can protect themselves by working in coalition with these groups that are already out there, and big national organizations that are out there working.
Yeah, just I would echo, like, there are lots of faculty members who are willing to work in solidarity with students. So find those people, or let us find you, and let us center your experiences without eclipsing your voices, but take on some of the emotional labor. I would also say, like, I don't know, I'm in New York, so I have a pretty good experience around my state chapter of NASW. And so working in collaboration and forming strategic alliances, like Ginger was saying, but that one might be one place, depending on the state you're in. And also, you may need to do some pushing in that area, but it is part of their charge to do legislative advocacy work.
Okay, I'm also now thinking about connecting back to curriculum, that coalition building is not something we often teach, but this is probably another addition. Okay, so we have about 5 more minutes before Dr. Peasley comes back to kind of close us out. Would love to just ask each of our panelists in closing any kind of last words that you'd like to share, and in particular where where can we find joy, community, and connection in the face of anti-trans legislation and the rhetoric that we're facing?
I mean, I don't know if this has been thrown out here, but I just want to recognize that today is Transgender Day of Visibility, and it's all about trans joy and really recognizing the accomplishments and the beauty of the trans community. So just recognizing days like today.
Yeah, I want to say that sometimes when we're talking about all the things that are difficult about the profession, it feels hard, right? Like we have an uphill battle. But then I think about how much joy I find in my life that is only made possible from queer and trans and non-binary people, because my queerness is my favorite thing about myself, and my non-binary partner brings me joy every day, and my trans best friend, and the young people that I work with that make me laugh every day, and that they can find joy in the face of everything that is going on for them. And I sit with a lot of privilege. It feels very easy to find joy in that, and to feel just uplifted by them being the future. And it makes me want to work harder to create a world in which they are the ones that are leading us. And Alex, I miss working with you so much, because we used to talk about this with our youth, like they're going to be leading us one day. They're going to be in charge of what we're doing. And we, that is my greatest honor, to work hard to not let them down. So thank you for closing with this beautiful question.
Yeah, so I guess two things. One, I not only find joy in sort of what is currently presently occurring, but also finding joy in the really wonderful, rich history of trans and queer communities through some lesser known works brings me personal joy. And I know that I have ragged on our professional associations this entire conversation, but I will say it is not all bad. I belong to several, and so I hope we can throw the links up to these. There are several amazing beautiful queer organizations in social work. So the Q Caucus, which is not affiliated with either NASW, CSW, or SWR, the three sort of large bodies. But then also, I think it was also mentioned CSOGI, which is the one that's connected to the Council on Social Work Education. There are some really great folks. I know many of you from those spaces, which I think helps us to collectively find joy in our individual spaces even. And I think someone listed there in West Virginia. There are some great folks actually in West Virginia doing some really wonderful work. So yeah, there are places and spots even at the national level to be excited and be engaged in this work.
I find a lot of joy in social work and the social work field when I speak to students. When I look at the new upcoming social workers that are coming out of educational institutions, even, I find a lot of joy when I have conversations like this, or when I'm on a panel like this, whether it's someone who is brand new to trans things, Trans 101, and whether it's someone who after 40 years comes to me and say like, I'm trans, I cannot think of all of the people that have just had the courage to share their journeys with me over the years, and the people I've had the opportunity to support and witness throughout their own journeys. And I also want to plug all the love I have for those who have lost along the way. and I hold them with the deepest respect and love. And it's sad, but it brings me joy. It still brings me joy thinking of those folks that I've lost along the way, because I'm still having this conversation. More and more of us want to make sure that no one loses people. More and more of us want to ensure, as social workers, we are in upholding the dignity and worth of every single person. And that brings me a lot of joy. It's a lot of complex feelings, for TDUB. It was originally Trans Day of, well, at first it was a lot of just recognizing all of the murders that were happening to Black trans women. So that's something to hold and to recognize. And also in the same light, say there's so much love that is still living out here.
Gender is really weird. And I find a lot of joy in playing with it, and especially when people don't want me to. And then in the moments when I'm not able to find joy in playing it with it myself, I love seeing other trans people do that. So trans people need to be in community with each other, and we need to get to see each other take this like incredibly serious social construct that confers a lot of power to some people and not others, and like both take that seriously at the same, and while at the same time like play.
I've taken joy in this tonight. This was a really worthwhile use of time, and I want to thank everyone who put so much work into organizing it. I really enjoyed talking to you all. I find joy in building with my trans and non-binary and so many other of my students, and imagining different ways of being in social work. And I find joy in the different research teams I work in coalition with other queer and trans and non-binary researchers and the young people that we collaborate with. So those are some of my spaces of joy.
Thank you all so much. I'm going to turn it back to Dr. Paisley.
Thank you. I don't know how I'm supposed to follow that. That was better than any closing that I'm going to do. But I wrote something while we were talking because I didn't want to write a closing until I knew what was going to happen. And so here's what I got. I'm blown away. Throughout our planning, we wanted this town hall to push boundaries, to call out and in social work and social work education, and to not repeat platitudes that we've heard before. And I'm so grateful that this discussion did that. I could not have asked for anything better than what you all brought. And this is because of you all. So thank you. Thanks to our speakers for your vulnerability and your courage, your willingness to speak truth to power, and the call to action for all of us, especially those of us with systemic power in social work and social work education. Thanks to my amazing coworkers for their time and work to put this together. And to all of you that came today, the chat both here and on the live stream have been so important, and they really get to how engaged you all are in demanding that social work and social work education do better. This may be the end of the town hall, but it's not the end of this work. We invite you to go out and engage in at least one of the action steps generated here today. If you want to get involved further, email us. I will put my email in the chat, or I will ask LB too. And I invite the other organizers to do so as well. Get involved, demand better of your educators. Darren, my colleagues might talk to me tomorrow about that too. It's okay, we can handle it. Demand better of your social work programs, the accrediting body, our licensing boards, and so on. The backlash against trans people is not going away, and we owe it to trans kids, families, students, and communities to hold ourselves and social work accountable and to radically do better, to advocate against these policies and support and center trans people in our work. So on behalf of all the organizers in solidarity, this is the end. Thank you all.
Thank you.